Hello, my name is Lara Nicholls, and today we are going to be taking an academic essay writing workshop. Essentially, I'm an art history PhD candidate, so quite a lot of the examples are going to be related to art history, but I've also used examples from a broader range of humanities subjects for us to look at while we sort through the issues that we experience when we're trying to write essays. And usually at university, we're trying to write essays, on top of each other. So we will have to submit something, and then 3 days later we have another one due, and then a week later another one due. So what we're trying to do is to develop skills to work out strategies for producing high quality essays under that sort of level of pressure. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen because I've got quite an extensive PowerPoint to work through. We will have a small break in the middle, and I'll come back to you at that point as well. So for now, I'm going to share the screen and we'll commence our essay writing workshop. I'll just put this into full screen mode. Great. So I am actually on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra in the Australian Capital Territory in Australia. And I would like to pay my respects to our elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge that this land that we have the great privilege to work and live upon has never been ceded. The music that you heard in the beginning of this podcast was by Eric Avery, and it's called Galinga, and it was recorded at the Conservatorium Theatre in Queensland in 2019, I think it was. That image that I show you is actually beautiful Ngunnawal country, Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. It's the ANU campus, and that is one of the spectacular works of art in our sculpture walk by Wolfgang Buttress, and it is called Una, and it was produced together with input from our astrophysics department as well. But just one of the many remarkable works of art on our sculpture walk at the Australian National University. So I'm a PhD candidate and a sessional academic in the Centre for Art History and Art Theory at the Australian National University. I currently teach First Nations art and culture, and I have also taught a course called Across the Pacific, Australian Art and American Art World. So I've been sort of supporting academic, and both of those courses were run by professors, Professor Brenda Croft and Dr. Sarah Scott and Professor Christopher McAuliffe. I'm the inaugural Jennifer Strauss Fellow in the Humanities, and I research women artists in particular, and I work particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, and I look at the transnational experience between Britain and Australia. I'm also a residential fellow at Bergman College, which is one of the residential colleges here, and I'm the fortunate co-producer of two podcasts, one called In the 19th Century and the other called Reading the Room, which was essentially about Virginia Woolf and it's just a reading really of Virginia Woolf's feminist text, A Room of One's Own. So in all of these roles, I get to write, but I also get to mark a lot of essays. And that experience has led me to think that some really basic skills could be in handy for a lot of undergraduate and postgraduate students. I do love reading essays. I'm always fossicking around trying to find new essays that have done remarkable things that I can use in my teaching experience. So I not only love reading other people's, but I also love writing them. The writing is hard, and that is true for everyone. Writing does not come easily when it's academic writing, and there's many strategies and techniques that we can learn to make this an easier job. So today we're going to look at what an essay is, common avoidable mistakes, understanding the question, the ideal structure to help us to actually build our essays, writing a thesis map and whether that can help us in structuring essays, introductions, the body of the essay and conclusions, language and references and captions. And there's a bonus track at the end on titles, which I've added in there as well. So at the end of this session, we're going to have a thesis map for a current essay question that you might be working with. And hopefully we may have even also written an introduction for an essay question that you're working on. So what actually is an essay? So the Oxford English Dictionary has listed that in English as a verb, it is this idea of to test the quality of something. As a noun in English, it's sort of an attempt or an effort. In the French, it comes from a noun essai, which means a trial, so sort of like a testing out of evidence. And from the Latin exegeum, from which we get the word exegesis, which is basically, again, this sort of weighing up of different cases. So in current usage, it's really just an essay really means a piece of writing on a particular subject. But in fact, it's a bit more than that. It is an argument and it's a contribution to a debate. And you always have to be thinking about who your audience is for your essay. Often people write essays without thinking of an audience in mind, and therefore the writing doesn't have that pitch. So if you are thinking of someone actually reading your essay, you probably wouldn't make many of the mistakes that you do make in them. So have that in your mind as this audience. And so you want to know who's going to read your essay, and you also need to remember that you are writing for a reader. And that will make quite a big difference to your approach, I think. Now, there are 6 characteristics of a good essay. Clarity. So your points are clearly articulated. There is also a sense of fluency. The text and the argument flows. Relevance. It answers the question that the task is to answer a question, and your essay is relevant to that question. It is concise, which means it uses few words to comprehensively explain a topic. So no rambling, just precision. It is convincing. So the argument is well structured and logical. 100 years ago, they would teach courses of logic at universities. And essentially that was this sort of idea of constructing a logical argument. And also informed. So a good essay is an informed essay, which means your writing is supported by high quality research and citations. And we'll get on to the issue of research shortly. Now, there are also problems that I've identified as I read through essays, and I think it could be really handy for you if I share these with you. So the 10 problems that I identify the most commonly, the first is significantly over or under the word count. University undergraduate essays, contrary to what you may feel, they're actually not that long. So if they're under the word count, it means you really have not taken the opportunity to put enough information in there. If they're over the word count, it means you've been too verbose and you've probably crammed too many things in there, and you need to cut an idea out or an argument out. So whatever you do, do not, if you hear strange noises, that's my dog. He was just shaking then, which was why it was kind of noisy. But getting back to the word count, do not write essays that are way over the word count. Even if it means you've put in lots of information that you find really interesting, you have to bear in mind your reader, who is a marker, and your marker, like me, is probably having to mark 50 essays in a short space of time, maybe 100, maybe more. They are not going to appreciate you writing an essay that's 1,000 words over the word count. So please don't do that. I have made that mistake myself, and I regret it every time. Now, poor quality research is the second most common thing I find, usually based on internet searches, not published scholarship. And this leads to the third problem, which is a weak bibliography and inaccurate footnotes, which don't use academic protocols. And we're going to get on to footnotes later on, that the reason you need to cite things is because you're acknowledging other work that's come before you. And also your reader might want to actually check up on those footnotes, not to check up on you, but to actually find out what that other person who you've cited has said. Now, the next 5 points really all relate to the same thing, which is all really about structure. So, 6 of these 10 points that are problems I've identified are all about poor structure. So the first of those is rambling introductions that don't recite an argument or a methodology. And many times I find this, and a student is actually, just 1 minute, my dog is making a lot of noise, so I'm just going to let him out. Hang on. Okay. Sorry, I'm back. Hopefully he will get out now. Rambling introductions that don't recite an argument or a methodology. I'm just going to have to. So we're back again after that interlude. My apologies. So what I often find with essays is that sometimes students, it takes them 3 paragraphs of preamble before they actually get into the subject. Don't do that. Don't ramble. Go straight into your topic, and we'll look at introductions shortly. But do not ramble and do not preamble. Conclusions that either don't exist or don't sum up the argument. We'll get onto those in a minute as well. And the other thing, real common problem is key points that are buried deep in the essay or paragraph, which suggests that there's a lack of a logical argument. Now, I do this myself, and I sort of saving up this sort of, great point to the end. No, don't do that. Put your great point at the beginning of your paragraph and then extrapolate. Paragraphs not linked together, so these are disparate ideas. And finally, in this sort of structure section, unbalanced structure. So you see an introduction that's 400 words, which is way too long, by the way. Next paragraph's only 150 words. There may be one paragraph's only one sentence. And so it's all unbalanced and uneven. Then also, we still see a lot of problems with grammar and spelling. Spelling is sort of easier to fix because of all of the things that you have online with your word programs and things, but grammar is something that is really, if it's a problem for you, and it is, I notice it's a really serious problem for a lot of students, you really do need to get some support, but it's pretty easy to get that support. There's online courses, and there's also literacy departments in universities where you can actually get help with these kind of things. So, but do put the effort into it, because it will help you articulate your argument so much more precisely and more interestingly as well. So grammar is your friend, so make friends with it. The other final thing is late without an extension request. So every university will allow you to request an extension for your work, and often we have many reasons why we need an extension. And markers like myself and conveners are very sympathetic. However, you will have marks deducted if you have not got that extension request in before the due date. So try and get that in as quickly as possible, and you might save yourself some marks, which could be the difference between a B and an A. So it's definitely worth doing that. Now, just on another final note, often I see students not including a title page. If you've written an essay that you're proud of, you should crown it with a title page, which means you put all your information on one page at the beginning, which really helps the marker, your name, if you're allowed to do that, name, student number, and importantly, the essay question that you are tackling. And if you're a visual arts student, make sure you put your images that you're going to talk about in your essay early on, maybe the next page after your title page. Right, so essay writing is a little bit like baking a cake. We need to know who is coming to tea, and you're going to be needing the following ingredients. So with a cake, you need a recipe. With an essay, you need a plan. With a cake, you need ingredients. With an essay, you need academic source material. In both cases, you need time. in both cases, you need space. So in the case of a cake, you need a kitchen. With an essay, you need a room of your own. Tableware you'll need for a cake, and an essay needs presentation. And with a cake, you're going to have diners, and with an essay, you're going to have readers. So the metaphor actually is quite a close metaphor, actually. So I likened it a little bit to two particular desserts. The first being that the messy essay, which is not structured and is hard to follow and not very enjoyable to read, is a little bit like the eaten mess. It has great ingredients in there potentially, but it's all jumbled up together. Now compare that with the French Fraisier cake that you can see here, where all the ingredients are the same just about, except they're ordered and structured in a very appetizing way. And you'll find that with that sort of type of arrangement, that there's texture to your essay and variety and interest. It's not all jumbled up together. It's actually layered and organized and ordered in a very comprehensible form, and also a very sort of appetizing form. So it's very interesting to read. So you can see that, you know, the ingredients often stay the same for the two versions. However, one is far more organized and ordered. Now, with an essay, the ingredients are slightly different, but one of the same things that it shares is this idea of time. So you do need to allocate a reasonable amount of time to complete your essay. So with a 2,500 word essay, you're going to at least need to leave a week probably to do the reading and the setting up and the argument, and then getting on with the writing, and then leaving enough time for editing. So in order to use your time effectively, it's good to choose an essay question which plays to your strengths. Choose a topic that you're interested in, and something that you know something about, and something that you know you can obtain good quality resources. Then you're going to need to do a literature review of those sources. So familiarize yourself with the source material, and start to jot down an assessment of those sources, because that's going to form probably a paragraph in your essay about what other scholars have said about this topic before you. And you're also going to want to make use of primary as well as secondary sources. So you'll refer to books and scholarly articles in addition to websites. You'll also find that at your university, your convener has posted remarkable material probably to the course page. Read that first, because that is probably going to be the key to the direction that your convener wants you to take in your essay. And it will certainly alert you to a whole lot of new texts that you may not have thought of before. So go to that easy point, your university course webpage, and check what the key texts are on that first before you go off and find other ones. Then do a super search through your university library. Now, I was really surprised at how few students have been doing this super search through their own university library. They just go off on a tangent onto the internet thinking they're going to find these essays and these source materials, and they don't find them. However, a super search or through your university catalogue search will bring all of the key material and the latest work to the fore, and you can select from that the sort of articles that you're going to want to rely upon as evidence in your essay. Another place to look also is Google Scholar. So if you just put your topic into Google Scholar and search, a number of essays will come up related to that essay question probably, because you're not going to be the first person to be delving into that topic. So see which ones are relevant, which are the most recent, and also look at things that are the most downloaded, because they're obviously becoming core texts. And then you're going to rank that source material. So just remembering that the biggest, most effective building block for your good essay is going to be the sources that you rely upon. So really do spend some time on this component of your essay and make sure you've got the best source material behind you before you start writing. Now, I've just given you some examples here also about a primary and secondary sources. So this here, this example here is a catalogue from 1941. It's an exhibition of Australian art that went to America. So that's a primary source document. It's a 1941 catalogue. And here are some secondary sources. So here's a fabulous article written by Caroline Jordan and Diane Kirkby about women modernists in the 1930s and 40s. So that's a secondary source. And here's another really important book written by the scholar T.J. Clark about, essentially painting in the second half of the 19th century, largely in Paris, actually, in France. So they're two examples of secondary sources. So you do want to be able to distinguish between all of those things. And at one point, after you've ranked all of your source material and read it, you're going to summarize the debate that you have picked up in that reading and that research. And that is really going to form probably an important paragraph in your essay. And it's going to show your marker that you're familiar with the debate and you have a response to it. Now, I just want to go back to this literature review idea again, and the place of electronic source material. So I really want you to be very careful of quality control in electronic source material. So yes, there's some good things about the internet. It's very easy to retrieve sources. It's easy to digest, and, don't have to leave the house. You can just sort of find them at home. But the cons to it are pretty significant, and that are that rarely scholarly, rarely adds to the critical debate, and rarely referenced, and quite often a marketing department or communications department may have written the material. And this can apply to things like gallery websites, whether they're institutional or commercial gallery websites. I see time and time again in art history people quoting things from commercial gallery websites. Well, they're all usually marketing material and sales material. It's not actually scholarship. So just use the internet to do general searches, but you're probably not going to be citing those searches unless, of course, your essay is about poor quality material on the internet or something. Now, the next important thing for you to look at before you even start writing is the rubric, which is really what we as markers use to assess an essay. So what are we marking your essay against? And it's a rubric. Now, they vary depending upon your department, but your convener will have put them up on your course website. So have a look at it to check how your essay is weighted, how they weight certain parts of it. Now, in summary, though, no matter what the rubric might be, they pretty much usually contain these four things in some form or another. So the quality of the argument, the quality of your analysis, the depths of your research, and your adherence to academic protocols. And then there's probably a fifth one in there as well, depending on what the assessment is. It may be, 10 marks for originality. It might, it could be anything. But essentially, most rubrics contain those four things. So you want to really make sure that you are showing that in your essays. And to be honest, if you just focus on this depth of research and spend time doing that literature review, you're going to cover a lot of that. Now, the question, this is really critical. Often we find that a student doesn't actually answer the question that has been asked, or they only half do, or they misunderstand the weightings of things in the question. So what you want to look at is, what are the key verbs in that question? What are the doing words in the question? What is it asking you to do? So here's some sample questions from a course I was tutoring in recently. And I've rearranged them a little bit just so I can use these verbs to show you how to sort of consider these kind of questions. So the first one is, why was Blue Poles, which is a painting by Jackson Pollock, such a significant purchase? Discuss in relation to Australian art and political culture. So this is sort of an assess and analyse and a discuss question. It's asking you to discuss this in relation to these particular things, Australian art and political culture. This one here is review the field exhibition of 1968. So you're going to have to review that exhibition. and examine the controversial debate surrounding it. So there was a lot of debate about this particular exhibition. It was a hard-edge abstraction exhibition that came at a time when there was big argument about whether Australian art should pursue figuration or abstraction. And the question is, was it a definitive moment in Australian art history? And if so, why? So that's a review and then examine. And then you've got to answer that question. Analyse the impact of the Cold War on the art world in Australia in the 1950s and 1960s with reference to several artists. That's an analyse. So that's going to really require you to go through quite a lot of material to analyse how the Cold War impacted the Australian art world. Number 4 is evaluate Rosalind Krause's position on public sculpture in her essay, Sculpture in the Expanded Field. So it's a really important essay. It's a brilliant essay, well worth reading. And it's asking you to evaluate that essay. And it's asking you to think about how that essay may have influenced Australian artists. And it wants you to discuss these things, discuss Rosalind Krause in relation to one or two artists. And then there's this other question about, was Australian art provincial, discussed in relation to Terry Smith, another scholar, his particular essay on the provincialism problem. So that's a discuss question. And then the question that I'm going to pull apart and use some structure mapping is this final one. Why was the influence of America so crucial in Australian art during the period from the 1960s to the 1990s? And this here, analyse how this was manifested in the work of two Australian artists. So this is the question I'm going to work with to show you how you can approach a question. So this is using structures to answer questions. So first of all, you need to build an essay plan. Now, essentially, this is a 2,500 word essay. It means that you're roughly going to have about 6 paragraphs with an introduction and a conclusion. Now, you're probably not going to write exactly to 300 words per paragraph, but this is a rough guide. You're certainly not going to really want to write much more than that. So that there you already know that you've got 6 moves in your argument that you're going to make. How you're going to work through those is another question, which we'll get to in a minute. But that you've got to approach your task of a 2,500 word essay, knowing that roughly it's going to have 6 paragraphs, an introduction and a conclusion. Now, a very old-fashioned way of writing an essay and answering a question. It was very neatly explained in a really lovely essay by the feminist art historian Linda Nochlin. And she wrote about the note topic method, which she employed in 1948 in Vassar College in New York. And she was writing an essay in answer to this particular question. Why would Beatrice Webb, a woman born to every privilege, dedicate her life to socialism and eventually become a convinced communist? So this is in 1948 when the Cold War is just starting to heat up. And her answer to that question in her essay won a very valuable prize. And the reason why it did was because she structured her essay very logically, and she was able to create quite a degree of fluency in that essay. And this is her methodology that she used to approach the topic at the time in 1948. Now, you could turn this into a high-tech version very easily, but she decides the topic and selects her essay question. She goes down to the stationer and buys note cards, dividers, and a box. She researches her question. She then, from that research, identifies key topics in that research, and she puts those key topics as titles on those dividers that she's bought. She summarized the key points on the cards, and she cited the source on those cards. And then she's filed the key point cards with the dividers. So she's got these dividers with the key topics, and behind those dividers is the cards with the key points for those titles and the citations. She puts them in order in the box. Then she writes an introduction, which sets up her hypothesis. And then she summarizes the information into paragraphs based on the order of those cards. And then she writes her conclusion. So essentially she's really done that, but she's used this physical apparatus of the box with the dividers and the cards. So, it's not a bad idea to even do that before you write an essay, because the handwriting act of sitting down and writing on a note card and ordering your points is actually quite clarifying. So as much as we might say, oh, it's a very old-fashioned way, it still works and would still produce a very good essay. Now, I tend to use another methodology, which really only requires a piece of paper and a pen, and it's the spider map. And I was very fortunate to learn this from Inga Mewburn, who is Professor Inga Mewburn at the Australian National University, also known as the Thesis Whisperer, and she has a website called The Thesis Whisperer, and she is expert at teaching people how to write better, particularly academic work. So I'm going to use this mapping tool that she taught me, which is the spider map, to analyse this question of why was the influence of America so crucial in Australian art during the period from the 1960s to the 1990s, and analyse how this was manifest in the work of two Australian artists. So I put my topic in the middle of that piece of paper. So you can see there, the topic boils down to the crucial influence of America in Australian art. And I've underlined that word crucial because I see that as a really pivotal word in this question, because I have to really decide whether I actually think it was crucial. Was the influence of America really that crucial in Australian art? Personally, I think it was one of many influences, but I'm going to have to make an argument for this essay, and I've only got 2,500 words. So from here, I've developed this, and this is the spider map. It's messy, but it works. So here's my topic in the middle again. And I break that topic down into two key buckets. One is American influence, and the second is Australian art. And I'm going to deal with American influence first because I have to define that. So yes or no, do I agree that American influence was crucial? No might be my answer. Other things were happening, e.g. Swinging London, Australia's engagement in Asia, First Nations art and culture, of course, the rise of the Western Desert art movement, a whole range of other things were happening, and I could argue that in my essay. But what I'm going to go through for is a bit of a hybrid. I'm going to go, yes, it was crucial, but there were other things happening that are interesting as well. So what was the influence? I have to explain it. So what forms did it take? So it took the forms of exhibitions to Australia, scholarship, so Clement Greenberg scholarship, and he came out here and lectured, a whole range of articles and literature and academic work which permeated through into Australian institutions, artists exchange, so American artists coming to Australia, Australian artists going to America, the National Gallery of Australia's collection established, and of course this major buying development where they essentially the collection acquired a number of works by leading American artists from the period, such as Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Willem de Kooning, and the list goes on. So I've decided there's quite a considerable amount of American influence, but I can't really spend that much time going through all of them. Otherwise, it'll be a very bland essay. It won't have much detail. So I'm going to I've decided to focus on two particular things. So the exhibitions of American art that came to Australia and the development of the National Gallery of Australia's collection and its acquisition policies, which allowed it to buy major works such as Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles, Mark Rothko's work, Willem de Kooning's work, etc., etc. So that's, I've worked out how I'm dealing with this American influence section. And then I'm going down to the section on Australian art. So what's the impact? So what was the impact of Australian art, of American art on Australian artists? And I have to then talk about the Australian artists who were potentially influenced by these things. So I've decided, because I know that both of these artists, John Nixon and Melinda Harper, responded to the National Gallery of Australia's travelling exhibitions. They sent their collection around Australia, and therefore Australian artists were exposed to all of these new works of art that were coming to Australia. And I also know that these artists would potentially experienced American work in these exhibitions, 2 decades of American painting. So I'm going to build up an argument about that, saying that these were very dominating factors, but I'm going to actually have a twist to it. And my twist is, well, I know John Nixon responded to the collection of American art in the National Gallery's collection, but he also responded to something very interesting, and that is the significant collection of Russian art that the National Gallery of Australia was buying at the time as well. And he responded to Russian constructivism and suprematism, etc. And so his work reflects those elements. So that's going to give my essay a bit of interest, I think. So it's not going to be all this one story of, you know, cultural flow all one way. And I think in the context of the Cold War, that's going to also be interesting. So once I've done all of that and worked out how my paragraphs are going to work, I can then move to my conclusion, which is going to interestingly sits here, and it brings together what was the influence and who did it influence. And there's my conclusion, just sitting there like that. Now, once I've done this sort of messy spider map like this, and I have to say this actual handwriting of ideas and crossing out of things is really helpful in getting your ideas together and working out what you need to do. Now, this turns into a much neater version once I get to the point where I'm about to write my essay. And so here in my introduction, I'm going to set the scene and the context, explain the debate, introduce my argument, and I'll explain my methodology. So that will be, I'm going to be looking at exhibitions of American art that came to Australia, and I'm going to be looking at the NGA's collection and the fact that it travelled its collection. And so here we just break down these ideas more. So paragraph 1 is all about the American influence and what I'm going to focus on. It's going to answer that provocation of that word crucial. I'm going to say, look, it was pretty important and quite influential. I don't think it was the only story. It's not crucial. The Australian art would have continued regardless, but it would have been slightly different. And then I go into my literature review for what have other scholars said about this topic, people of note, and also some recent material. So probably going to look at 2 or 3 scholars' work, and then I'm going to make my conclusion about that. Then paragraph 3 is about the forms of that influence expanded. So I'm going to go into some case studies. And then paragraph 4 is going into this idea of the National Gallery's collection of American art and, as we now know, Russian art. And then paragraph 5 and 6 are the 2 artists that I selected. And then my conclusion is going to sum all of that up. So that's how a handwritten map and ordering your ideas and dealing with structure before you start to write will then help you to get a logical argument going, hopefully. So now we're going to look at introductions. So essentially in an introduction, you have got 5 to 6 moves that you're going to make, which means you're probably only going to have 5 to 6 lines in your introduction. And it is not going to be more than 250 words. If it's more than 250 words, you've got to go back to the drawing board. So essentially what you're going to do is you're going to set the scene and you're going to announce the question or topic. Now you can do that in quite creative ways. You don't have to say, this is about XYZ topic. You can introduce it in a quite sophisticated way, which I'll show you in a moment with some other examples from some leading scholars. And you're also then going to follow it up by the purpose of your essay. What are you doing? Why are you bothering doing this? Have you got some new information to unload? What's happening? You're going to introduce the debate and the sources upon which you rely. It's just one sentence. This is where the debate's at, and these sources, etc. And then you're going to reveal your argument. So you're not going to save your argument up to the end. You're going to tell me in advance what you're going to argue, because as a scholar, I'm going to go, do I really want to read this essay to learn about this thing? What's their argument? Is it new? Is it interesting? Explain your methodology, how you're going to convince me. So is it going to be by using primary source material? Is it some new letters that you've discovered, new photographs? What is it? What's your methodology? And then you're going to summarize the argument in the final sentence, which is going to hint at your conclusion. And that's all in 250 words. So let's look at some very good introductions, because I think once you get your introduction sorted out, you're well on the way to getting your essay done. So this image is actually a work of art. It's a really stunning engraving from the 1720s about the South Sea bubble in London, when a lot of people lost a lot of money when the South Sea bubble collapsed, but also a number of people made a lot of money during that period as well. And this artist decided to encapsulate that experience of that bursting bubble in this work of art. And these are all the promissory notes and bonds and all kinds of sort of financial instruments all floating around in this image, which apparently the streets of London were full of at the time. So I've picked a particular essay about this work of art because I want to show you how the author approached her introduction. So it's by Teresa Goldring, and it's called The Greater Fool, Paper, Illusion, and Time in Representations of the South Sea Bubble. And it's in 18th century studies. So she opens her introduction with a scene setting statement, which I think is a really great way to do it. In the autumn of 1720, the joint stock venture, the South Sea Company, imploded in a swirl of paper. Company shares, notes of credit, receipts of sale, newspapers and other ephemera littered the streets of London like ashes of recently lost fortune. So she's really set the scene for this essay. But she's also, it's not just literary, it also alludes to the topics that she's going to expand upon. As if preserving these documents where they fell, two collage prints published by Thomas Bowles II, both entitled The Bubbler's Medley, or A Sketch of the Times being Europe's Memorial of the Year 1720, resemble the artifacts of this paper world. This article considers Bowles' visual depictions of the financial calamity known as the South Sea Bubble to illustrate the emergence of a modern idea of a bubble from this flurry of paper. So she's telling us what she's going to do in her essay. So she set the scene, she's expanded upon it and referred to the objects in fact, the methodology that she's going to use, and then she's telling us what her essay is going to do. And then she goes on to expand a bit more about that bubble. A bubble which had been formerly considered a crooked swindle became an economic opportunity offered by a cycle of speculation in which value depends on when one enters and exits the market. Analysis of the visual form and narrative content of the two bubblers' medleys suggests that these prints invite viewers to participate in a paper economy in which financial instruments both simultaneously have fictitious value and offer opportunity for actual profit. So this is really her methodology. It's the analysis of this visual form. It's the analysis of these two prints that's going to form a key cornerstone of her argument. By illustrating the importance of timing in select visual elements, I illustrate that in Bowles' Bubblers' Medleys, successful speculation depends most importantly on when one acts. The Bubblers' Medleys thus demonstrate that the printed image provided a critical medium through which to envisage the new relationships swept in by the South Sea amongst paper, value, and time. So the one thing I notice about this introduction is that she steps us through how her argument's going to work, and she sets up the scene really beautifully. And she talks about quite complex ideas, actually. So she's got ideas around art history and ideas around the printed image and visual culture. And she's also got ideas around political economy and economics. And all of these are quite complicated ideas, ideas about value and profit, economics, markets, all these things quite complicated, but not once does she use a single word that any of us would not know what it means. It's all very simple language, but complicated subject. And that is a key underpinning characteristic of a great essay, is a complex, in-depth analysis using simple language that we can all understand. So here I've just broken this introduction down into those moves I mentioned before. So you can see she sets the scene here. She introduces the debate and the sources that she's going to be looking at. She introduces the purpose of the essay, why she's bothering to write it. And then she introduces her argument and then the methodology. So her methodology being that she's going to use the Bubbler's Medley prints to expand this idea. And she wants to also look at this idea of speculation in the 18th century and this idea of how one participates in that sort of economy. And then she sort of summarizes the argument at the end and hints at a conclusion. So I think that's a really great introduction to look at and to study for when you come to write introductions. And I've got more for us to look at because I feel the introduction is such an important start to your essay. And it also reveals how well-versed you are with your topic. So I do want to spend a bit more time on it. So the next one is probably an example to use when you've got a much longer essay to deal with. 2,500 words is not going to really allow you to do what Ruth Morgan's done here. So this is Ruth Morgan's essay, which I highly recommend for anyone who's interested in historical, on conservation history. It's called Dry Continent Dreaming, Australian Visions of Using Antarctic Icebergs for Water Supplies. Now, this was a thing. It was this idea about harvesting icebergs to deal with our water shortage problems. And she has this great scene setter here at the beginning, which is actually an anecdote and it's a story of what happened that really does set up the scene. So this is this side here. On a wet Saturday morning in early 1978, Australians woke to the news that an iceberg was being towed into Sydney Harbour. Radio and television stations announced this incredible sight and broadcast its progress towards the Opera House as Sydney-siders flocked to witness the iceberg's arrival. For months, newspapers had reported that the iceberg cometh. Australian entrepreneur Dick Smith would captain the voyage, and he promised to carve the iceberg into ice cubes, which he called Dixicles, which he would sell for 10 cents each. Just the previous year, Smith, an accomplished aviator and businessman, had organised the first Australian sightseeing flights over Antarctica. As Dickenberg 1 approached the harbour, however, the pouring rain revealed that the iceberg was, in fact, a pile of firefighting foam and shaving cream. It was April's Fool's Day, and Smith had played a practical joke on the nation. And then she moves into a more classical introduction. Now, the one I have got here is, in fact, her abstract. It's not her next paragraph, but her abstract could be used in an academic undergraduate style essay as a classic introduction, and it's a really great abstract. So this is the abstract about her whole article, Dry Continent Dreaming. So I like the way she moves into this introduction, or how she sets up this abstract in a way where she's immediately tackling what the purpose of the article is. So it traces the little studied development of Australian interest in iceberg utilisation from the 1960s to the early 1990s. Fostered by Cold War global anxieties about water availability, iceberg utilisation offered a means to overcome hydrological limits to growth. Drawing on Patrick McRae's characterisation of the visioneer, this article examines the arguments that Australian scientists raised in support of iceberg utilisation during the 1970s and 1980s. So she here in this section here explains some of the source material she's going to look at. She's going to be looking at Patrick McRae's work on this idea of the visioneer, which is kind of an idea of a creative engineer, I suppose, someone who's going to do big infrastructure things in a visionary way. Focusing on Perth, Western Australia, as a prospective destination for harvested Antarctic icebergs, Australian visioneers appealed to settler narratives of heroic water engineering and Antarctic exploration and exploitation. So she's telling us what she's going to focus her discussion on, which is handy to know. And she's also linking it, because she is a historian, she's linking it to these narrative strategies that are quite common in Australian history. Although this scheme for iceberg utilisation was unrealised, its study reveals the particular circumstances that shaped the visionaries and their vision, as well as the circumstances that hindered their achievement. So she really sets up this really interesting idea for this essay. She explains what material she's going to use, what the focus of her research is, and then what her analysis is. So that to me is also a really outstanding sort of style of introduction that you could also use. And if you've got enough word count up your sleeve, by all means use these really interesting form of that sort of scene setter that Ruth Morgan has used here. Here's another example. This is from a PhD thesis, which was turned into a book by Catherine Fisher. So her thesis was so good that it was published as a book. And I want you to look at a couple of things about this. One, it's got a great title, Sound Citizens. So this has got this idea about citizenry and also about, solid, ethical, high quality citizens. The public voices of Australian women broadcasters from 1923 to 1956. So we already know this is about women broadcasters, and we also know it's about citizenship, just really by the basis of her title. And she's used a classic example of that scene setting opening line. In 1954, Dame Enid Lyons argued that radio had created a bigger revolution in the life of a woman than anything that had happened any time, as it brought the public sphere into the home and women into the public sphere. So that's a great scene setting, interesting opening line. And taking this claim as its starting point, this thesis examines how a cohort of professional women broadcasters, activists and politicians used radio to contribute to the public sphere and improve women's status in Australia between 1923 and 1956. So she's wasted no time in telling us what this essay or this thesis is going to do. And then she goes on to the scholarship on this, the context of her research and the scholarship, the debate already. And then it goes on to say how she's going to analyse this and where her conclusions are heading. Now, I won't keep going through this, but it's another example of a really brilliant introduction. And you can see all those moves that I mentioned before taking place. So you can go back and look at this and pause it and read that more thoroughly. But I think that's a really great example of another sort of introduction. And here's one for the art history students. I often use this introduction for my students because it is an example of a near, or if not perfect, introduction. It's also on a topic I'm very interested in, which is the Bloomsbury Group. But it is called, it's by Lisa Tickner, who is a feminist scholar and art historian. It's called Vanessa Bell, Studland Beach, Domesticity and Significant Form. And Studland Beach, of course, is a beach in Dorset in the UK. And her essay is all about this painting by Vanessa Bell. And it's also about Vanessa Bell's sister, Virginia Woolf, and her book, To the Lighthouse. So here's her introduction. It is very succinct. So she starts off, Vanessa Bell's Studland Beach has been described in its move towards abstraction as one of the most radical works of the time in England. So the reason I use this introduction for my students is because Lisa Tickner immediately takes us to the subject of her essay, which is this painting by Vanessa Bell. She immediately positions us in our mind with this painting. And that's the key topic. She hasn't preambled, nothing. She's taken us straight there. She's also taken us straight to the literature, which is remarkable to do that in the first sentence. So we know it's about this painting, and she also quotes what an author has said about it, which is, in its move towards abstraction, it's considered one of the most radical works of the time in England. I think she's quoting Roger Fry, and I can't remember now, but it's a, so she's done two things. She's introduced the topic and she's introduced the literature. And then she goes on to use visual analysis as her next point. It is indeed a striking, spare, and reticent image, but not perhaps fully accountable in these terms. So she then describes the image, and she's used visual analysis to do that. And I'll just take you back to the image and think of those words: striking, spare, reticent. It is all of those. This work has no embellishments. It is not practicing realism in any shape or form. It's not practicing verisimilitude. It is exactly what she says: striking, spare, and reticent. And the palette also is, very reduced, which again, that's an idea of spareness. It belongs with a small body of paintings and photographs derived from Bell's trips to Studland, England between 1909 and 1912. So she sticks it in the middle of its context, which I really like as well. At the same time, it is clearly a studio picture intended to have a particular status as a finished and radically simplified image, something that could be understood in terms of significant form, that is, in terms of an aesthetic, purged of narrative, sentiment, or circumstantial detail. So significant form is an idea that she talks about in her essay, and it's this idea that Roger Fry posed. And then because she realizes that people reading this essay may not know what this is, she then expands upon what this might mean. So significant form is, that is, an aesthetic purged of narrative, sentiment, and circumstantial detail. So remember what I said before, it's not a realistic depiction of the image. It's purged of narrative. We don't know what the narrative is. Sentiment and circumstantial detail. It's just these blocks of figures on the beach as forms. In what follows, I shall look first at the paintings, then the concept of significant form, then at the invention of the beach, and finally at Bell's painting in the context of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, published in 1927. So after all of these sort of introductory remarks about this work of art, the debate around it, she then tells us exactly what she's going to do, which she doesn't say in this essay, she says in what follows, and that's kind of quite elegant as well. So I think it's a really great introduction and one that's really worth studying. She is a master, so it's really hard for us to emulate this sort of quality of writing, but I think it's really worth looking at these great examples to help us on our way to trying to produce work like that as well. Here's another type of introduction, this time Caroline Jordan and Diane Kirkby's introduction. And this is the kind of introduction that you use when you're introducing new material and new analysis. So, which often is the case with Caroline Jordan's work in particular. They say here, it has often been observed with pride and puzzlement that women artists were the leaders in introducing and promoting European modernism in the visual arts in between the wars Australia. Analysis is focused on the why of this, with attributions ranging from the loss of a generation of male artists in World War I to the impact of first wave feminism, rather than on the how. So she's already setting up that her essay, or that they are setting up that their essay is going to be about how was it that women had the opportunity to lead modernism in Australia, is essentially what she's going to do. So do the kind of things that Vanessa Bell was doing in Studland Beach, but in Australia. So this is another example of one that you can just pause on this recording and look at more carefully how she's set up this introduction, and how you can use an introduction to explain that you've got new material and new analysis that you're going to share with your reader in the body of your essay. Now we get to the body of the essay, which is the core of your work. Now, I've just quoted my supervisor, who has often says to me in my thesis when I hand drafts in, again, often the key points are buried mid-paragraph rather than being at the top of your paragraph as a signpost for your argument. So that is poor Dr. Sarah Scott, who's had to read lots of my essays and lots of my drafts and finds that I keep burying the key points. So don't do what I do. Make sure you put your key points as your signposts, as your title sentences in your paragraphs. Don't save the key points up to the end. And so whenever I see this in the drafts I get back, I do flip them and change it and put those key points at the beginning. And the paragraph is so much better as a result. So remember, in the body of your essay, you're going to be building your paragraphs with a signpost or with a title sentence for your paragraph. So topic sentence, if you like, topic sentence for each paragraph. And you should be able to do those topic sentences before you go to write your essay. So the body of an essay is really the logical flow of your argument, segmented into concise paragraphs. These paragraphs expand on each key point of your argument. And so you've decided what your key points are before you sat down to write. And these key points are backed up by evidence, which you are going to explain in your essay. And these paragraphs are going to be connected. And the entire structure, therefore, is going to convince your reader of your argument. Now, here are two examples of linking paragraphs. So often I find students have a lot of trouble in linking paragraphs. So they feel like they're just floating, they're not connected within the argument. So the first one is from Peter Gonewagen's Feminism and Political Economy in Victorian England. And I just wanted to show you up here in the top of page 33. So you don't have to know what that paragraph said previously. Just come from here, from this point. From none of their writings does one gain any suggestion of the numbers of women actually engaged in paid work in agriculture, in industry, in home-based work, or in domestic service. On the contrary, the general picture presented is one in which women were not engaged in paid labour, but are primarily dependents. Then his next paragraph links. On the rare occasions when women's paid labour was mentioned, it was presented always as something which was unusual and as a problem. Mill is particularly interesting here. So here he gets to talk about John Stuart Mill, because in his few brief discussions on women and work in his political economy, so he's citing the source material, he adopts two somewhat contradictory positions. So then he can go on to talk about these positions. So the point of this was just to show you how this academic had linked these two paragraphs to develop his argument. So he's talking about the writings of Mill and possibly John Stuart Mill and probably Harriet Mill. I'm not sure who he's talked about in the previous page, about these ideas of paid work. And then he makes this point that we don't really see women as being in paid labour in this time. And then he goes on to talk about, at the few occasions when it was mentioned, how it was mentioned. So he's linked these paragraphs really nicely. Now you can see here in Pamela Garish-Nunn's essay on what's actually a book on Victorian women artists, she's done a similar thing, but she's also used quotations. And I wanted you to see how the quotations are used because she's done them quite nicely. So this is about Henrietta Ward, who is an artist whose husband died. She was left with a lot of children to look after and support, so she had to go and start an art school. So she says here, she later claimed in her autobiography that there was no other similar establishment in London at the time, i.e. no other art school. The great demand, which apparently greeted it, therefore quite understandable. And then she has this opportunity to quote what Henrietta Ward and how her experience of arriving at her art school. So I've got this really great sense of the art school actually operating in that period and how it was absolutely full. She said, I was accustomed to finding a hall full of parents and guardians wishing to drop their daughters to my art school. And then she quotes Tessa Mackenzie's The Art Schools of London book, which is 1895, describing the art school in the following terms. So she's used here primary source material really nicely. So this is a lovely quote from her subject, Henrietta Ward. And here is another quote from another book from 1895, by a person called Tessa Mackenzie, who talks about the art schools of London. And then she links this very nicely. In the original press accounts of her school, however, so she's introducing a new point. So she's talked about these interesting primary sources on the art school. And then she goes to the press accounts and she says, in the original press accounts of her school, however, such exclusiveness was not implied. Parents whose daughters are anxious to pursue art either as a profession or an accomplishment will be exceedingly fortunate in obtaining the aid thus brought within their reach, reported the Art Journal in 1879. So this is a counter view that there were, in fact, quite a number of art schools at the time that you could go to. So you can see how she's developing her argument around art schools and the availability of art schools for women. And she's used interesting primary source material and quotes, and she's linked them all very nicely in her quite economical way of writing. And again, both of these academics have written in a very simple language. It's very specific, niche, complex ideas, but in a very readable way. So this kind of thing could stem from a setup like this. So if you really need to map it out really to the nth degree, you can use this as the sort of thing that you would get from your academic skills units at your university. So I know at Australian National University, we have an academic skills unit, which is available to any of our students. And this is the kind of material that they'd be providing you with to help you structure your essays. So if you're really struggling on your points and your argument development, use this. It's a way of working out whether an argument's a bit weak, and if there isn't a weak link in your argument, just get rid of it and focus on the strong ones. The important thing is, in a 2,500 word essay, you cannot put too many arguments in there. Focus on the key arguments and detail them. Make sure they're detailed. Now, conclusions. So a conclusion is a summary of your argument. It is actually your final call to arms to believe you. This is the point where you bring it all together and explain that this argument is really sound and solid and believable. It is not the place to introduce new information. Now, often I will find in essays, this new unrelated information pops up in a conclusion, and it just really stands out, and it really confounds me, and it makes no sense, and it doesn't help the argument. In fact, it weakens the whole argument you've just made. No new information in a conclusion, only the argument you've already positioned for the reader, summarized in a really neat, pithy way. Re-emphasize your key points, reiterate your argument. And I haven't picked out conclusions, but these are something you could do as an exercise whenever you're reading any of the scholarly material that's posted on your website, so your course websites. Look at the conclusions and see how the scholars have built them and developed them, and which ones are really effective. And I'm not saying copy them, but assess them and look at their methodology and apply their methodology. Now, finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about language, because one of the things I often find is that this sort of confusing academic speak language can wend its way into essays, or bad grammar doesn't really allow for sort of a fluency of language. So we want you to use subject-specific language that shows that you are well-versed in the topic, but we don't want you to use gobbledygook. We don't want you to use sort of highly technical phrases that no one's going to understand, or that require you to have paragraphs of definitions, etc. So you want to get a concise and simple language around what you are writing about. I like this Simone de Beauvoir opening to The Second Sex, which is a very famous feminist book, and note the date, 1949. So this is before second wave feminism. And I think it's really interesting. She opens up by saying, I hesitated a long time before writing a book on woman. The subject is irritating, especially for women, and it is not new. So I just thought this is kind of interesting, you know, when you're reading and writing about feminism, how there's often a lot of misnomers and untruths about it. And even in 1949, it was not a new subject, not at all. And the misuse of language and even the fact that the subject of woman itself as a subject was irritating. So I just thought that was kind of a very interesting opening gambit to her book, very famous book. So you need to kind of develop a language around your topic, understand it, and you need to grasp the terms that are used. So the best way to do this is by reading the best material of your subject, really. And the other thing is you may not agree with the key terms that are being used, and you may want to argue against them. But you need to understand them before you can possibly argue against them. So everything is arguable, but you need to understand the base from which you argue from. Further points on language, so the descriptive, explanatory, or analytical. And language used to describe a subject is potentially different to, say, language that you're going to use to analyze a subject. So you want to be explaining what you're doing in your essay, and you want to be explaining what you understand. And, you know, what does the information you're explaining signify? Now, to do all of this, it's usually in a scholarly essay better to use an active voice, not a passive voice. And I'll show you some of that in a minute. But the kind of things that you're doing in an essay, the verbs, the doing words that you're doing in your essay are arguing, analysing, assessing, qualifying, summarising, asserting, suggesting, indicating, rebutting, critiquing, disqualifying. All of those words carry a kind of meaning. So if you're going to write a really sort of polemical essay, you're probably going to be doing, you know, lots of rebutting and asserting and, you know, strong words like that. But if you're doing a historiography of a subject, you're probably going to be doing more assessing, critiquing, you know, those kind of things, analysing. So, you know, what are those sort of words that most fit what you're actually doing? So we'll just have a look at some sentence structures with active and passive frameworks. So, you know, the basis of a sentence is the old subject, verb, object. That is what a sentence is. The cat sat on a mat. It's a subject, verb, object construction. And then you can complicate it and make it more complicated. Now, that's an active way of saying it. The cat sat on a mat, or the mat that the cat sat on, that is passive. So the second way is a passive construction. The mat that the cat was sitting on, that's passive. The cat sat on a mat is active. So here is an example of an active sentence. Michelangelo sculpted his 4 unfinished figures of prisoners, also known as slaves, between 1519 and 1534. Another active sentence would be the curator displayed the contentious works of art in a nuanced, thoughtful arrangement. So the curator is the subject. What did he or she do? Displayed. What did they display? Contentious works of art being the object. The curator displayed the contentious works of art. We all know what's happening there. And this added element is the way in which it was done. Now, a passive construction of those, which I often see in essays, and that never works, and it always takes up more words. The 4 unfinished figures of prisoners, also known as slaves, were sculpted by Michelangelo between 1519 and 1534. So it's flipped it, and the subject and the object are not doing the same things as what they were in the first configuration. It takes up more words. It is not as tidy, and that's actually quite a clean version of a passive voice, actually, but often they're less tidy. They're less clear than that. The second version, you can see, definitely takes up more words and is messier. So these contentious works of art were displayed in the gallery by the curator, who was able to arrange them in a nuanced and thoughtful arrangement. So all these things happening like this, and things happen too. You know, it's not, you haven't got an actor, protagonist doing something to something else. Things are having things done to them, and it takes longer to explain that, and it's weaker. So I hope that just sort of shows how that active and passive voice can function in your sentence constructions. Finally, we look at referencing. So often people say, oh, why is it so important? It's usually worth about 10% or 15% in your essay, maybe more depending on who's setting the task and what the task is. And often you will get marked down for it. And people say it's not fair. Why, the essay itself was good. Well, actually, to be quite honest, if your referencing is rubbish, your essay is probably not going to be very good, actually, as it turns out. So get this right. So you need to have an acknowledgement of scholarly contribution of others. That is essentially what a reference is. You're acknowledging debate and literature and the work that has come before you, and you are citing their work. And you are citing it out of respect for their work, and you're also citing it so other scholars can come along and examine that citation. So it has a practical use, and it's all there for the reader. It's there for the audience. It's not there for you, really. It's there for the reader. Invariably, you're going to be writing for a scholarly audience, and it's quite likely that they will be looking up your references. Now, this is not because they're checking whether you've done them correctly or whether they're any good or whatever it might be, or checking if the page number's right. It's actually because they really want to use the reference. They want to actually refer to the reference, and they need to be able to look it up correctly. They want to go to the page that you've cited, and so they want to know that those details are correct. And it's probably because they're interested in the topic and they want to find out what that other scholar has said. So there's a practical reason. It's also an indication that your argument is deep or more sound. You've cited something, you've cited evidence, which makes your argument better. Now, if you've got works of art or images or graphs or whatever it might be, indexes, appendices, whatever, that are captioned in your essay, these need to be captioned properly. And this is really important. So when it comes to a work of art, the caption and the cataloguing is the DNA of that work. It is essential reading. I need to know whether this is an oil painting or a watercolor. I need to know if it's a lithograph. I need to know which gallery owns it. I need to know all that information. And you actually also do need to cite properly for copyright reasons as well. So make sure your captions are thorough. And then this sort of final point is that scholarly essays have a kind of a look and a form, and they signify that you are familiar with the conventions and that you respect them, and these conventions do have clear purposes. So you want the cosmetic look of your essay to actually indicate and signify that you are on board with that form and that you're working with it. So yes, make sure your captions and your references are correct. And this is going to bring you to what style that you use. Now, I am a Chicago person. I don't at all like Harvard. And I'll tell you the reason I don't like Harvard is because, or any referencing system for that matter, that puts the brackets, the source in the sentence. I don't want any sentence interrupted by paraphernalia. I want the sentences to flow. I want my reader to be able to keep reading what I'm writing. And if I'm reading an essay, I want to keep reading it. I don't want to be interrupted by something in a bracket with a footnote and a this and that. Chicago to me is much more elegant. So here is a Chicago style of a footnote, the author being here, the title here, and then I've also put here when it was first published, because this was actually commissioned and published in Art Forum. So Sol LeWitt was asked to explain what the hell is conceptual art, basically. What is it all about? What does it mean? Because in 1967, a lot of people didn't know what it meant. And so he decided to write these paragraphs on conceptual art. And in fact, the paragraphs have become a work of art in their own right. And if you're ever interested in reading them, they are so well worth reading. Anyway, aside from that, I have actually quoted it from this book, though, Art Language, May 1969. That's the page number. Now, here's the footnote of a book, Griselda Pollock's Vision and Difference. Here's the publisher, when it was first published. Well, the one I'm working with is a 2003 edition, but I also make a note of when it was first published. And the page number A page number must go into the footnote. And then finally, an article in a journal. Anne Stevens' very interesting essay on the local presence of solar wet. In fact, I made a mistake here because I haven't put the date of that journal in there, and I can't remember. But it's this particular volume and series, and that's the page number. So there's my mistake. So that's annoying for someone wanting to look at it now. They don't know what date it was, and they don't know the date of that actual essay. So see how annoying that mistake that I've made there is. And then the bibliography appears something like that with your actual internet coordinates there, and also the dates that you access them as well. And captions. So I've just looked at Anthea Callan's wonderful book called The Work of Art, which is all about plein air painting and artistic identity in 19th century France. This is a beautiful book all about many things, but she goes into a lot of detail about materials and techniques and on plein air painting. And she has decided to use this absolutely stunning work by Paul Cézanne of Mont Saint-Victoire and the viaduct in the Valley, River Valley. And so she's captioned it all beautifully there, the artist name, title, the dates, medium and dimensions. But what she hasn't put in there, which I would put, is the actual collection that it's in. So it might be a private collection or it might be a gallery. So I would be putting in those details of the credit line for that work of art and what gallery or museum it's in, or whether it's in a private collection. And captions for works of art in general, this is for the art history students listening to this. Now, you don't need to put all of this stuff here in, like you don't say artist name, then the name of the artist, but I'm just telling you these are the things that need to go into the caption. That is what it's going to end up looking like. So let's just, actually I won't play with that because it'll mess up my slide. So that's what your caption will look like. And it has all those things in it, but you don't need to put that with it. I don't need to know that you're telling me that that's the artist name. I know that's the artist name. And finally, this idea of titles. This is the bonus track on this. So often we go to all this trouble to write our essays and research, etc. And then we don't put a title onto the essay. And in fact, some students don't put title pages. They just launch straight into the essay. And I go to mark it and I don't know who's written the essay. I don't know what question they're answering. So give your essay a title page, which has all the key information. Check with your convener about whether you are supposed to put your student number or your name, or whether you can put both. Sometimes they have to be anonymous, but make sure above everything else that you include the question that you're answering and you include your word count there, because the word count that invariably turns up in the systems at university is the word count that includes all of the footnotes and bibliography, captions, etc. So do that. But once you've written your essay, and maybe even before you've written your essay, have a play with some titles. Think of a title for your essay. So, and here's a great blog from Chelsea Lee, and I think she summarized everything really well. A great title summarizes the main idea of the paper. So it's, not really sort of oblique or obscure. It's going to give the reader the main idea. And one of the key reasons why this is a good idea is because it'll be really easy to search. It's very searchable. So you want a title that's very searchable. A great title is not a very long title, so 12 words or fewer. And you can see some ridiculous titles. In the 19th century, they would write the longest titles. I should have found some for you to share them, but they were so long. Don't do that. Keep it nice and short and pithy and to the point. It also includes words that contribute to the meaning. So a study of, an experimental investigation of, the results of, etc. And a great title, interestingly enough, she says, gives away the ending. So if the title is in the form of a yes or no question, try emphasizing it so that the question is answered or the answer is at least alluded to. So she's given two examples here, which I really like. They're quite funny. So there's one question, there's one title here, Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, empathy in non-human species. But then decided to call it, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And that's a far more interesting title. Like, I want to know that. Do they dream of electric sheep? It's really kind of catchy and interesting. And I think it goes to the core of some of the issues in that essay. And then a great title says it with style. So academic writing must be precise, but it needn't be fusty. Consider these titles of real published psychology articles: The Unicorn, The Normal Curve, and Other Improbable Creatures, and Pride, Prejudice, and Ambivalence Toward a Unified Theory of Race and Ethnicity. So I think she makes some really good ideas there. And I think if you start to put titles onto your essays and start thinking of them in that way, you're going to feel that you've finished your essay, and also going to be appealing to the marker who's reading probably 50 or more essays in one go. And I've just dragged out some such catchy titles which I found and I rather liked, just to show you. I think these are great. So, one of the classics that I've read, and I've read a number of times, is Griselda Pollock and Rosika Parker's book, Old Mistresses, Women, Art and Ideology. That's a great title. This is another equally great essay entitled Only Women Should Go to Turkey, on Riyad Brown and Women's Orientalism. But there's this great one about John Steinbeck too. John Steinbeck on the political capacities of everyday folk, Mums, Reds and Marjo's Revolt. So that is the end of our workshop on essay writing. I hope that has been really interesting for you. I'm going to stop the sharing now. I really wish you well in your endeavours to write better essays, and I'm hoping that these skills and approaches and strategies will take the pain out of having to write essays, especially when you have to write a number of essays in a short space of time. These techniques should serve you really well in trying to break down the task at hand and to write with greater fluency. And just remember that the golden rule is research good quality material. If you're doing that, your essay is going to be so much better. Thank you.